This lecture will focus on the police, their history, subculture, some issues of corruption, and use of force. So the role of the police, the they have the whole thing: serve and protect, help out in the community. It's been highlighted recently, though, that the police are charged with far too many tasks. There are de facto mental health counselors. They handle any issue of disorderly conduct, issues that would better be served with a help of a social worker, familial conflicts. They do a lot. They're expected to do a lot. They're expected to basically do everything that another government agency doesn't do. What that falls into is basically the crime fighter, which is the sort of sexy job they show on the posters of jumping over fences and shooting cats out of the trees. But really, the main thing they do is order maintenance, traffic control, making sure that people aren't fighting with one another in their homes or in the streets. Uh, it's mostly order maintenance what they do. Those mundane things, those necessary things, those daily things that another government agency doesn't do. The history of American policing comes from England, where we get the structure. And as the organized policing developed, it was sort of based on the need. So if you have these small towns, there's not a lot of need for policing. The small areas can basically handle it themselves. As you started to have more trade and commerce and communications between other small areas, you started to see um, these groups develop, and one group might look over several smaller villages in an area. Just as the need for it expanded. So we see cities start to expand. One of the first charges of early, what we would call law enforcement agencies, were in the Night's Watch. And they had two basic functions. They were there to guard the business districts of towns that were fairly deserted at night. Same way today, where there are not a lot of um, people in those areas after dark. So they're often targets for criminals. They were there to protect the businesses when no one else was there. They're also there to look out for fires, because when you're in 1600s, everything's made out of wood, stone, straw, and there's no way to really mechanically pump water onto a fire. So that was very big and very important aspect of the job, was to watch out for that. One of the first um, organized police forces, not police force, law enforcement agency in major cities were what are known as thief takers. And this is very similar to what happened in early United States, where you had slave patrols. In the case of the United States, they were there to bring back runaway slaves, enforcing the social status quo of slavery at the time. The thief takers in England were there as basically bounty hunters. They were there to bring back people who had committed crimes, bring them before the court. Um, One of the most successful of these groups was known as the Bow Street Runners. They were headed by Henry Felding. Again, just a very successful group of bounty hunters, doing work and bringing those individuals before the court that the court didn't have the ability to do itself. The first major organized police force, separate from the military, was developed in London, London Metropolitan Police Force in the 1820s. The first head of that force was Sir Robert Peel, which is why today English police are called peelers or bobbies for Robert Peel. Um, it was in a direct. They were having a lot of problems with sending the military in to quell civil unrest. So you had food riots, you had other civil unrest happening in London. Just sending the military in resulted in people getting shot, resulted in negative perceptions of the government. So they tried to reduce that by making the police force unarmed. They put them in blue instead of red uniforms, things to delineate them from the military, which is a very important charge that they had at that time, and something that we've since sort of gone the opposite way from. Early colonial policing. The early policing looked very similar to the sort of the Frankenpledge system that we saw in the past in England, where it was based on the needs of an individual area. As the need increased, more police forces were formed, more localized police. You started to see sheriffs pop up, things like that. In the major cities in the East at that time, this is where we see what we call the political era of policing, where the police were basically just a gang for various political engines at the time. There was very little training. There was no promotion based on merit. It was promotion based on nepotism. Uh, we see that start to change in the early part of the 20th century, but it wasn't really until um, the time just before and then after World War II that we really get away from a lot of the political era problems and bring in the professional era policing, where we try to train people well, train them to a high standard, hire educated officers, promote officers based on merit and things like that, incorporation of technology. But it took a lot to push and to get people to change, to get away from those old ways of corruption and nepotism and things like that. The problem with the professional era was that it removed almost all the familiarity that the police had with the neighborhood. So to avoid a police officer from exploiting a business, they put the officers in the cars, they mixed up the details and things like that. And then, 20, 30 years later in the 1960s, 1970s, the police don't know who the people in the neighborhood are. So we start to see a push then in sort of the community era, where we're trying to get more police involvement, trying to get police to be part of the community, know who the community members are, who the stakeholders in the community are, who the good guys and the bad guys in the community are. Um, but at the same time that was happening, we also see. Oh, I thought that was on a slide there. We also see the militarization of police taking place in the 1980s with the war on drugs, and the community era and the militaristic era have been running side by side ever since then, and they are really at odds with one another. And the militaristic approach of police has contributed to and exacerbated a lot of the issues facing the police in the United States at this time. Not buying into the community policing, not buying into the benefits that it has prevented the police from building the bonds that it needs to in the community at this time. So U.S. law enforcement, the federal supersedes the state level, although there's more jurisdictional specificity than there is in the court system, and we'll see that in just a little bit, or see that next week actually with the court system. But you have the federal system, the state level law enforcement, county, local, jurisdictional, and I'm sorry, county, local level. You have a lot of jurisdictional overlap. Sometimes there can be miscommunication between agencies. So that's something that police have worked consciously at the last 20 years to really try to avoid those miscommunications and have open channels of communication between various police agencies. The setup of the federal law enforcement, it's broken up mainly in the majority of the federal law enforcement is in the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. The Justice Department has the FBI, DEA, the U.S. Marshals. The Treasury Department also has two agencies, the IRS and the ATF. The IRS handles investigations of business-related fraud or fraud on individuals' parts in terms of paying the taxes. Oftentimes it's used against businesses. ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and explosives. Probably soon to be Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, or Explosives and Marijuana, as the continued laws with that change. They'll need some sort of federal oversight at some point. The Postal Service does investigations typically in conjunction with like the DEA, the FBI with drug-related issues, but they also do a fair amount of investigation into the dissemination of child pornography. Because the illegal nature and the increased online monitoring of that behavior, a lot of the offenders have gone low-tech, and they'll send Polaroids, things like that, through the mail to try to avoid detection. You also have the Department of the Interior, which handles issues arising in national parks, and then Department of Homeland Security, which has the bulk after the Justice Department. ICE is in there, FEMA, Coast Guard, Also, the Secret Service, in addition to monitoring high-value assets, protecting them, they also investigate crimes related to counterfeiting. And then international, you have Interpol, which is basically the FBI of the world. They don't operate usually on American soil. They operate in conjunction with the FBI if they need to do something here. Non-federal, state level, that's state bureaus of investigation, state highway patrol, agencies under the governor's office of public safety, things like that. County could be a police department, it could be a sheriff's department, it could be both. Typically, when they have both, they're going to share responsibilities, do different things. So the police might handle, traffic and serving arrest warrants and things like that. Whereas the sheriff's department might do, sending court notices, not necessarily going to get people on warrants, but giving them notice of that, handling the courthouse, handling the jail. If you don't have both, you just have one or the other, they're typically going to do all the tasks. But oftentimes in major, larger counties, they're going to have both for a better I've completely blanked on the word I'm looking for. We're just going to move on. Then you have local police, which could be town. Again, takes various incarnations depending on the needs of that area. Sometimes local areas are just handled by the county police or the sheriff's department. Basically, they're just what the area needs and what the area can afford. You also have private sector law enforcement, which is typically going to be how serious they are is based on how serious the things that they're guarding. So Paul Blart and the mall cops, not very serious. Segways, they're not armed. If you go to like a movie studio, like Turner Studios downtown, everybody's got guns and they have controlled access to every place, everywhere in that building, because they're dealing with multi-million dollars of intellectual properties. I think they just paid $1 billion to show the baseball playoffs this year. Then you have volunteer police force, which can be community members, it can be retired police officers just trying to have a larger presence, more eyes, able to observe and report. Police corruption is an issue that's come up a lot recently. It's not new that it's come up, but it's an issue that we're trying to handle, trying to deal with, trying to better understand, try to illuminate. Typically, a department is going to have 0 to 7, 10% officers committing corruption. 7-10% is high. It's really high. Most departments don't have anywhere near that number, but it does happen. It says 9 types of corruption. There's only 8 on there. I took 1 off. I didn't like it. It's fired. So 8 types of corruption that we have. Taking meals and services. This can fluctuate. Some departments allow that to happen if it's one meal, but if the deli wants to give you a sandwich, that's probably okay. You probably shouldn't be taking 10 pounds of roast beef out of there. So it just depends on what the history is there, whether or not they're allowed to do that. Opportunistic theft, stealing from crime scenes, stealing from drug dealers, things like that. We also have shakedowns, where they're basically going to criminals and telling them, you're going to give me some money or I'm going to bust you, or making prostitutes give them sexual services to avoid prosecution, things like that. Case fixing can be lying on the stand, or it could be removal of evidence, things of that nature. Kickbacks are typically more consensual than shakedowns. So, situation where a drug dealer gets proactive and gives the money to the police ahead of time, or works through channels to figure out who they could or couldn't potentially corrupt. Planned theft, again, not likely that it happens to happen all the time, but it has happened in the past where you have police officers that have gotten organized groups together to engage in things like organized drug robbery or even murder for hire. That can be somewhat problematic when it gets to that point. Also running protection for drug organizations, or potentially like shuttling contraband across the city, things of that nature. and also private security when they're supposed to be working. So it's sort of double dipping, working. You're on the clock as a police officer, but you're being paid extra to work private security somewhere. Again, various departments have different regulations on when and where that can happen, but it is an issue of corruption in some departments. Um, one of the biggest exposés into police corruption was the Knapp Commission, which was in New York, and they basically found that there were two types of offenders, grass eaters and meat eaters. So the grass eaters were the ones that were taking sexual favors from prostitutes or taking the drugs that a drug dealer might have on them, taking money from a drug dealer, things like that on the street, exploiting local businesses for free food and services, free bottles of liquor, stuff like that. Meat eaters were the ones that were committing the organized theft or committing the murders for hire or shuttling drugs across the city. The report held that the grass eaters were more problematic because if you don't have those people committing those small offenses, it never even comes into mind that you can commit these larger offenses. So it's sort of a kind of counter to think about it, but if you think about it in terms of dinosaurs, which is where the terms are coming from, if you only have meat eaters, all the meat eaters eat themselves. So you have to have those grass eaters for the meat eaters to be able to flourish. It is an issue with police because there's no way to really avoid these circumstances. Drugs are worth money. Money is worth money. So when you have a situation where people are stressed out, underpaid, and they're encountering large amounts of cash that's unregistered, unregulated, it creates a situation where they might make a bad decision. Also, police aren't managed, every minute of the day by their supervisor. They're out on the street doing what has to be done. So it again creates opportunities where corruption can happen. Solutions to this are hiring better educated officers, paying them more, promoting more positive pro-social thinking officers, also doing incorporating economics into background checks. So looking at people with good credit. You don't want to hire a police officer that's got $250,000 in bad debt because that individual is going to be more likely to engage in monetary-based corruption. So that's become a developing aspect of police procedure. So police use of force, and again, this is something that's every semester I have new examples of this. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but it's also very, very important to understand the difference between unnecessary force and police brutality, why it happens, why we have a distinction. Police brutality is actions that are taken that the police officers knows are illegal and intended to serve some illegal purpose. Kneeling on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds is police brutality. It's an intentional homicide to serve an illegal purpose. That is one of the clearest examples of police brutality that has been observed either through these viral videos or not in recent memory. Unnecessary force is when more force is used in a situation than could have been used, but it's not criminal. The reason we have that distinction is because these decisions have to be made in the immediate. This idea of split-second syndrome. The police do not have time to assess. They don't have 20 seconds to assess a situation and see what's happening. They have 2 seconds to assess that situation, and they have to make a decision that may cost their life. It may cost the life of bystanders, of other officers. It may cost the life of the suspect. But they have to make that decision in that time frame. And for most officers, they're going to want to err on the side of using too much force than not enough. Because using too much force is bad for the suspect. And It's unfortunate. No police officer, no good police officer wants to go to work and kill someone during the day. If there are police officers that want to do that, they should be fired. If they engage in actions to that effect, they should be prosecuted. But all good officers go to work and their main focus is coming back home with their job and with their safety. So they're going to err on the side of using too much force on the suspect to make that happen for themselves and the other officers around them and the other civilians around them. So if the suspect is the one that created the situation that is causing a potential threat to the officers or the people around them, they're going to use force, and they're going to use as much force as they feel is required to end that situation, and then assess it later, and then try to figure out what if it's a situation where it is unnecessary force. How do we learn from that? How do we take these negative things that happen that are not criminal and try to avoid them happening in the future? How do we learn as much from these bad situations? The term that's been, and I've heard the term before, but I've heard it used a lot in the last couple of days, is lawful but awful to describe particular types of police shootings. I don't like that because I think most police officers would agree with me that most, if not all, of the shootings that they engage in are awful. Again, nobody wants to shoot someone. If they do, they shouldn't be a police officer. That's something that's going to flag in a psych test early in the hiring process, and we'll talk about the hiring process. I think in the next PowerPoint. But those people shouldn't be police officers. And the police officers that we have, the vast majority of them don't want to use their gun. That's the last thing they want to do. But when they're in a situation where their safety is at risk, the other officer's safety is at risk, and the bystander's safeties are at risk, they're left with few options in a lot of these cases. The scale of force that they have, first is the mere presence. Just a police officer being in a situation changes that situation. If you've ever, been, at a concert, walking down the street, people act differently around police officers. It might be that they have fear. It might be that they have contraband. They're worried about that. It might be that they just don't want to talk to the police officers. But the presence of a police officer in a social situation affects that situation. The next level of force beyond that is persuasion. So asking something to happen. If the police officer is, say, at a concert doing crowd control or on the street, and someone is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, loitering or smoking in an area where they're smoking, you shouldn't smoke cigarettes anyway. It's an asshole product. I wouldn't say that people that smoke are assholes, but you are polluting everybody around you. It smells disgusting. It makes your house stink. It makes your car stink. It's expensive. I don't understand that. The money thing is ridiculous how much it costs. I mean, it should cost more for the effects that it has. But anyway, so say someone's smoking where they shouldn't be smoking. The police officer asks them, put the cigarette out. If they don't do that, then the police officer tells them to do that, which might come with some consequences. They say, can you please put the cigarette out? It's persuasion. The next one is put out the cigarette. More forceful. If the person doesn't do that, again, there's the implication that there might be consequences stemming from that. If the voice commands don't work, if the situation warrants it, there might be a firm grip. So if the person is going to be taken into custody, I've only seen someone arrested for smoking a cigarette once, and that was after the police officer at the concert had told them 4 times to put it out. I've seen people arrested for smoking other kinds of cigarettes, but this was a tobacco one we're talking about here. So after the voice commands are not met, and then you have firm grip. Okay, so that's being arrested. If the police want to arrest you, that's what's going to happen. Okay, there's no preventing an illegal arrest. You can't run away from the police. It's not a good idea. It's only going to result in further higher ups on the scale of force. Um, so if the place to argue an illegal arrest is in the courts, that's why we have the court system in place. It's not on the side of the road. So if you get to the point of firm grip, which is typically going to either be an arrest or lead to an arrest, that's what has to happen. If the firm grips are not working, then you have pain compliance, which are basically arm locks. I've also heard that a dry fire with a taser was considered pain compliance. It almost seems like an impact device, basically shooting somebody with a taser and not turning on the electricity. That seems like a bad idea. Most common pain compliance is like a arm lock. They've been incorporating more judo and jiu-jitsu and police training, so they teach them some of those pain compliance holds. If that's not working, that's when you have impact devices using batons, tasers, and things like that. If that's still not working, then the only option left is deadly force, and that is the firearms. The firearms are deadly force. The police do not shoot to wound. It is impractical for anyone to expect the police to shoot someone in the arm or leg. That's not how firearms work. The reason they teach officers to shoot center mass is because it's the easiest target to hit. You want to avoid missing the target and shooting someone behind them. So when the police use a firearm is deadly force. To that point, they use rounds that are made to break up inside what they hit to avoid the possibility of a through and through. To avoid the danger to civilians or other people around a situation. When the police can use deadly force was established in the Supreme Court case Tennessee versus Garner. It established what is known as now the fleeing felon rule. Before this case, the fleeing felon rule meant that if the police were pursuing a fleeing suspect that was suspected of committing a felony, they could shoot to kill, which is ridiculous. That's some bullshit from the Old West, shooting people off the back of horses. In this case, Garner had broken into a house, stole a purse that had $10 in it. It was shot in the back going over a fence. That's obscene. They're presenting no threat to anyone. There was no evidence of any kind of a weapon, and he was unarmed at the time. But the police shot him in the back. What the Supreme Court changed the rule and the interpretation of the rule to be is that if you have a fleeing suspect suspected of committing a felony that is posing a threat, an immediate threat to people around them, then you can engage in deadly force. So if the person is fleeing from a felony charge and they are armed with a weapon that is presenting an imminent threat to people around them, then the police can use deadly force. Our criminal due process system is set up as an adversarial system, which means innocent until proven guilty or pled guilty. That's typically for the police to collect evidence, then present that evidence to the district attorney, presents that case at trial. There's no expectation to testify. In fact, if you are testifying in your own defense, something went wrong. Something went wrong with the game plan. I often equate the defendant testifying to having to go for it on 4th and 15, in the fourth quarter, and if you don't get it, you're going to lose. Now, if you're not the Patriots team from a few years ago, you're probably not going to win in that situation. And the only reason they won in that situation was extremely effective coaching. Had little or nothing to do with any of the players on the field, just extremely effective coaching. Okay, so no expectation to testify, and yet the guilt has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you plead guilty, that's beyond a reasonable doubt. But in terms of evidence, they have to prove that that's what happened. Okay, these are various Supreme Court cases that have impacted the police, either directly through their actions or into the court system. Over the past, starting in 1833 and up to 1993. I put a link here for oea.org. I want you to go through this website. It conglomerates Supreme Court cases, and go through each of these cases and look at the major findings, what the results were, what are the implications on society at large, and the police, because there will be a few of them represented on the exam. Some important ones. I mean, they're all important, but big ones. Mapp versus Ohio, very big. Terry versus Ohio, also very big. Minnesota versus Dickerson goes with the Terry case. But yeah, go through, look at all these, and just sort of go over the top and start all the way down. Don't start in the middle or something like that. You want to go through chronologically because the cases kind of build off one another. And you check those out, and just sort of contextualize those with what things we've talked about with the police, and the way that you've seen police operate throughout the course of your observations of the police. And then we'll pick up in the next lecture with part 2 of the police.